Good morning. Continuing the review and summary of conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1448. Aleph Taf Mem Ches, discussing Atzilus. Is Atzilus a structure with details? Meaning a division and separation of different functions? Or is it all one composite? So why is it relevant? Because he's speaking about the Gili in the time of Matan Torah. Matan Torah was such a divine revelation of divine unity that it caused even the human senses to lose their distinction in the fact that they could see sounds and they could hear sights, like we learned at the bottom of last page, 1447. Why? Because the Gili Alakuz was bli hischalkus, bli shum hischalkus. Generally speaking, the divine comes down into structures. So there's Chochmah, there's Bina, there's Riyah, there's Shmiyah. Just like it is with a human being. Everything has its location, its place. They coordinate. It's one human being, we're not just a sum of parts, but each has its function. But when you have a Gili that comes from a higher place, like he calls it the Gili from Atzilus Mamish, that does that without any of the partitions and structures. So then a Gili, and the same thing was by the Beis Hamikdash. Then the Shmi and the Riyah, they become like one. They cross over, and they all become like one. So because Atzilus lo yesh is chalkus madregas. Because in Atzilus we don't find distinction of levels. But then he says, don't we know that Atzilus is made up of structure? That's what distinguishes Atzilus from what higher than Atzilus. I'm summing up what we learned. Everything is utter seamless unity. Achdus mamash he called. And there's Eris and Kalim, there's energies and containers, there's Chachma Atzilus, Bina Atzilus. So now he's coming to answer that question. That's where we stopped. But he said one line and then he's coming to explain. He said, so yes, indeed, Atzilus does have different functions and different aspects to it, but it's not as chalkus mamish. With levels that are separate, that are different and separate from one another. So here's some type of in-between level. On one hand, yes, there are levels, but you can't yet call they're not in the sense where they're separate from each other. There's a certain oneness and unity that prevails even among this diversity. So before we read on, let me just explain it in simple English. You can have an entity that's made up of parts, but the parts either they conflict with each other, that's one thing. But even if they don't conflict with each other, they may not be a perfect symmetry or a perfect harmony. I mean, you see that. I remember once asking a musician, a conductor. I said, what would an orchestra look like without a conductor? They're all reading the notes. They're all professionals. They can play together. Why do you need a conductor? So he showed me a video of an orchestra without a conductor. It was quite good, but there were a few places where he pointed out you had to be somewhat of an expert to see it, and where you could see certain transitions were somewhat a little choppy. So the conductor adds that certain dimension that you can't fully put your finger on, because each of the musicians is doing their job. It's not like they know what they're doing, and they are reading the same notes, so they know what everyone else is playing. In other words, so you could have ischalkus but it's not hischalkus mamish, and therefore there's room for a certain disparity, if you wish. But then Atzilus is like the perfect unity of harmony within diversity. Higher than Atzilus, it's an Achdus, like we're going to learn. We don't have diversity yet. But in diversity, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, the diversity is starting to become very prominent, and each have their own identity. And therefore, there's, even though they coordinate with each other and they can work together, I mean, you see, even on Earth, you have entities, you have organizations and businesses with thousands of employees, and it's well managed. You can have a very coordinated and harmonious system. But we all know there's always possibility of different things. Atzilus would be the epitome. Think of it as the template, or I would say even better, the archetype of perfect harmony within diversity. And that's why by Matan Torah, when there was that Gili, the Shmiya and the Riyah were able to so-called interchange. Just giving an overview, but we're going to learn it inside now, more specifically with examples. So Atzilus is the perfect interface, because on one hand you already have structure, on the other hand the structure is all what dominates is the conductor, if you wish, God. Everything knows it's a piece of the godly puzzle, so to speak. And as such, that's a very high level. That's Atzilus Mamish. So it's not as Chalkus Mamish in the context of Nivdolis and Nifrodis. It has distinctions, but they're not really separate, because there's that. A healthy body would be another example. When a healthy body is humming along, you can't even tell that there's levels. You know, when your blood is rushing properly, thank God, or your digestive system is working, it just flows. We take it for granted. You breathe. You don't have to, God forbid, you see someone struggling to breathe, you right away know that there's a bunch of pieces, something is blocking, or God forbid, or there's an impediment, or there's something that is not aligned properly. So health is a perfect example of this as well, because the body is a structure. The body is not one cell. It's not one. It's made up of hundreds, thousands, and of ultimately trillions of cells. And yet a healthy body would be an example. Now, it's not exactly like Atzilus, because you can't say the body is aligned to godliness. It's aligned in a healthy way. But imagine someone who's 24/7, like I mentioned, the Ovis, Merkava, they were 24/7 completely aligned with what God wants of them. Okay, that's just somewhat explaining it in simple English. Now let's learn it inside. Top of page 1448. We're on the fifth line, fourth line, I should say. And if you want to follow along the text, and you don't have the safe for the book, just go to ayinbeis.com. The PDF, the whole volume 3 is there. So it says, Va'inyanhu. This is the inyan in explaining this so-called dual property or paradox even of Atzilus. Commotion is barely ill, as was explained earlier. Dibra maschil b'yem hashmini atzeres habeis. Hagimel. Because in Hemshech Ayin Beis, the Maimer b'yem hashmini atzeres, there are three different years, because the Hemshech continued for a number of years. So he says the third one, the bottom, they tell us the page in volume 2, page 691. What do we learn there? So there the Rebbe Rashab, quoting an Alter Rebbe's Maimer, talked about a very interesting thing. Mashaniska loshe b'chinas lamayla. So this is based on an Alter Rebbe's Maimer. He asked the question, we learn all the time in a Maimer, you say chachma, but then you say b'chinas chachma. Why do we need the word b'china? B'chinas bina, b'chinas oir, b'chinas ke'eb. What does b'china mean? So usually we interpret b'china as, we translate b'china into level, a level of chachma. Why the word b'china? If you think b'china also means like a test. When you're boichen something, you measure something, so it's called a boichen. You're boichen, you test it, you evaluate it. So what does the word b'china mean? So back there, like I said in volume 2, the Rebbe Rashab discussed it. It's based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. Fascinating insight, because the Alter Rebbe is analyzing the word b'china. So what does it mean when we say b'china l'mayla? She says, "Zeu al derech moshel." The reason it says that, it's like, for example, b'chinas hakesef. So he gives an example from a chemist. It's actually an example of a chemist. I mean, you take an alloy, or you take any element. Let's take kesef is silver. So we all know a person who works with silver, there's silver as it comes originally from the mine. It's raw, and then you want to know how much of it is silver, and how much of it is sediment. So there's a whole process that a chemist or someone that's processing it measures, and that's what they'll say. They'll say 100% pure solid gold, which is very rare. But then it could be 90% or 95%, and the rest is what we called in Hebrew sigim. That's like sediment, either pieces of dust or pieces of rock. Something that's same thing with diamonds. To have a completely pure 100%, honestly, I'm not really an expert, so I don't know how rare that is. But generally speaking, there's always something in there because that's the nature of the beast. So he says like this: when you take a raw piece of silver, before anyone's processed it, the sigim are like the sediments. Sigim are like particles. They're not separate from the good, meaning from the silver itself. It's all part of one piece of rock, one piece of silver. So if you look at it with a naked eye, you may not even see. And this is true about other matters. He's just using silver as an example. That's the example I think the Alter Rebbe uses. Just muhus echad sheyesh bechinas kesef ateiv b'misper kach v'kach, which has within it a certain amount of silver with a certain number, whatever that may be. If let's say 100 is our base number, so you could say 90%. So 90 against 10 particles, 10 against 10 parts is that, or it's 80 and 20, or 95 and 5. He's not going into the obvious numbers. But that's what you have. You have one piece of silver that has in it these sediment or these particles, and has that, and it's all like one piece of metal. So too, for example, is be'eses spheres the Atzilus. Is the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Shakolu etzem muhus echad. Everything is one etzem, one core, and one entity. Mamish, literally. Sheyesh ba'asara keiches. It has 10 faculties. So you can used to use the example, this is Atzilus, but you could also use the example of a human being. It's 10 faculties. You don't say it's made up of 10 parts. You say it's one entity that has 10 components to it. So obviously, it does have parts, but it's not, you mix together parts, it's all part of one piece, just like when you take one piece of silver. Sheyesh ba'asara keiches, keich hachachma, keich habina. The imayes, and even though shehein b'chinas eres b'kelim, and even though they are coming in a structure of energies into containers, but when you look at an energy in a container, can you tell the difference between my physical hand and the power that I have in my hand to move the hand? Once they join together, even though initially they're two different entities. So this is in addition to the fact that Chachma and Bina are two different faculties. Each faculty has like a keli and a ur, like a body and a soul. But they come together as one. So he says, Hakol hu elikus mamish. So in Atzilus, it's all divine. Let me just continue, and I'll go back to the word b'china in a moment. Va'kelim. So how do you explain that? So he says the kelim are kadein kamtza de levushim meneyabei. This is an example used in Medrash. It's similar. There's different interpretations of what kamtza is, but most people interpret it like a snail. So you have creatures. A turtle would be another example. There are a few examples where their shell is not an outside garment. So kedin kamtza The levusha menei bay, its garment, is like when I put on a jacket, the jacket doesn't become part of me. But by these animals, their shell is part of them. It grows with them. But it is a shell. It's not their very body. So within that shell lies the actual animal. Like in this case, whether it's a snail, as I said, a turtle. I think there's another animal that they use it. I mean, there's a few that have the shell b'nei bay. So he's giving examples. So the keli and Atzilus is b'nei bay. In Bria, you would say the levush is already an outer garment that can be removed. It's not quite as seamlessly connected. But in the kelim of Atzilus, it's connected. That's the example he's using. Val kain hakol etzem echad. So therefore, everything is one etzem. This is his explanation how Atzilus, yes, there's structure, but what dominates in the structure is the unifying element that's made up of parts. And that's how he explains Pchina, Pchina's Chachma. So the Alter Rebbe explains, the Rebbe Rashab cites it back in that Maimer, B'yem Hashmini Atzeres, in volume 2. He says, that's why it says Pchina, because it's saying that you're not talking about just Chachma Bina, just the pure Chachma Bina. It's the Bechina of Chachma. The amount is a certain amount that you measure. That's what Bechina means, to measure. I said to evaluate. That a chemist uses to measure. So that's why we call it Bechina's Chachma. How much of it is Chachma? How much of it is Bina? Because it's all really part of one entity, like one piece of silver. And then you can start measuring how much each one is in there. That's how he explained it there. You can go there and look if you want more details. But bottom line is, with this he's explained, this seeming contradiction. On one hand, he said, Atzilus is Achdus, B'li Chalkus. That's why Riyah and Shmiya by Matan Torah were interchangeable, to sight and sound. On the other hand, we know Atzilus is made up of a structure. So that's what the first thing he says to explain this. So then the question is, what about higher than Atzilus? Where the unity is even higher because there's no structure. So he says, Rak shalamaylam Atzilus. When we go higher than Atzilus, there, lo yesh b'chinas chachma ubina klal. There you don't even have chachma and bina. You may have the origins of it, the roots of it, the seeds of it. But Atzilus is made up of, Atzilus is a full structure. There's an actual entity. But that entity is all united as one. So in a sense, you don't even have b'chinas chachma and what he says, 1 second. Yeah, Leishkin's Chachma being a klal. Well, commission is bodily ill. Now he's taking us to what we learned as we explained earlier. And this is, what did I write here? Page 1438, around 10 pages ago. By Eses Firis Shebekeser Atzmei. So there we discussed, there the Rebbe Rashab discussed, what do the Esses spheres, the 10 spheres, look like in Keser? In Atzilus, we just discussed that. We just explained it. What do they look like in Keser? Keser is higher than Atzilus. Shezeu shereitzel is chakim. Remember, Keser is the level of Ratzin. So what is it? The Chachma in Keser means the Ratzin, that he desires to conceive of ideas. V'reitzel lehasig. And he desires to comprehend. That's Bina. Shakolu rotzim v'lei chachma Bina. It's a beautiful explanation. In other words, there's two stages. When a person says, I want to now use my koyach hachachma, the first stage is, I want to do that. If you don't have a will, you're not going to do it. Just because you have faculties, it doesn't mean they're actualized. So the rotzim, to use chachma, that's chachma shebekeseh. The actual using of Chachma is Chachma and Atzilus. Same thing with Bina. Same thing with Chesed. Before you do Chesed, you have to want to do Chesed. So the Ratzim for Chesed, that's the Chesed in Keser. So you can't really call it Chesed because the will to do it doesn't mean you're doing it. Actual Chesed is only in Atzilus. But it's driven by the will to do so. That's the Ratzim. So when we learn about Keser, that Keser, God wanted it, it's like a level before the actualization of it. So in Atzilus, it's actually being done and they're all united because it's all Elikus. The Chesed of his Elikus, Chachma, Bina, and everything is part of that. Higher than Atzilus, You don't say there's the levels of Chachma and Bina, you say there's the Ratzon for Chachma and Bina. So it's more subtle, but you could still say there is still something, because the desire for Chachma is not the desire for Bina. But a desire is far more sublime and far less tangible and defined as the actual faculty itself. So what you really have here is a fascinating evolution, if you wish. If you go all the way back to the source, Hashem Echad is not even a Ratzon, not for Chachma, not for Bina, there's not even a Ratzon altogether. Then comes a desire. Like we learned, Oliver is saying he desires existence. Then comes the specifics, the desire for Chachma, the desire for Bina. Then comes actual Chachma and actual Bina. Then comes, that's Atzilus. Then comes Chachma and Bina as they start becoming an identity of their own, independent of Elikus. Not quite as seamless. So that's the process. And they're all Esosfiris. However, obviously, the higher you go, the more they less distinguished they are. The lower you go, the more defined they become. And Atzilus is the perfect medium. They're defined, but they're all one. They're all seamlessly connected. They're all part of that one picture, that one piece of silver, or like he said, all kol alakus. And even the kelim are part of the Ur, like he gave the example. Okay. Atzilus, in contrast to Kesed, heim b'chinas Chachma Bina. Not just the Ratzon for Chachma Bina, the desire, but actual Chachma Bina. Avaloi sheim badregas nivdalis. But on the other hand, they're not separate entities. They're all part of one organism or one reality called Atzilus. Let me stop here for any questions. It's very, very well, very eloquently explained, the Rebbe Rashab. But nevertheless, if somebody wants to clarify anything. The Yesh Lemer. Now the Rebbe Rashab is going to add now a Yesh Lemer that we can say, to explain this further, Bedugme b'bchinas Akudim. So Akudim is even higher than Keser. Keser, there's 10 spheres, but it's all the Ratzon for Chachma, the Ratzon for Bina. Akudim is a world where we talked about 10 energies in one container. Think of it like the moment of conception. One cell, within it is concentrated all the cells that will split. But for that point, it's one cell, it's 10 energies in one container. So he says, Shehin Eser Eris Akudim B'klei Echad. 10 energies bound in one container. That's the world of Akudim. Sha Eser Eris Einan B'bchinas Ischalkos. Again, let's look at the cell. If you looked at a cell that was just conceived, where an egg was fertilized by a seed, and has not yet split, I think it takes 18 hours for the first split. It will split into 2, and then into 4, into 8, 16, and ultimately to trillions of cells. But right now, you look at it, you have to say it has within it concentrated everything that will come from it, because it's not going to be added later. Just like an apple seed in the ground, though it's not an apple tree yet, but it has all the potential within it. So he says, so there's the Eser Eres there, but they're not Bechinas Eschalkos. There you can't even talk about distinction. In Atzilus, 10 spheres. They're all working together in a coordinated way. Umakol Mokame in Eser Eres. And you're still calling them 10 energies. Umavur b'mokam acher. And now he brings from elsewhere. He's going to give a dugma from Nigla, the Gemara. Shazeu al derech she'amru b'mishnah Perek Tes de Menachos. That this is similar to what the Mishnah says in chapter 9 in Masechta Menachos. Yeah, I see here that in Mishnayos is chapter 9. I wrote on the side here that in our Gemara, it's actually chapter 10. It's page 88, 87b. Shana says, Hoyu behin, at kan lepad, at kan la'ayel. So let me look it up. I remember I looked it up then, explaining it. Almost believe. Just give me a second. I'm going to just bring the Gemara here. Might as well look inside. I don't want to speak from memory. I learned this Gemara a number of times, but I'm trying to remember. Okay, 1 second, please. Okay. Always good to look inside. It's a good habit. Make less mistakes, get things clearer. Ayin Beis, the Mishnah. Okay, here we go. Is it? Yeah, here we are. So he's talking here about. Let me just 1 second, please. He's talking about the different measures in the Beis Hamikdash. So there were measures of dry things like, for example, flour, but they also used in the Mishkan things that were liquid, water or other liquids. So he talks here about the measures of the liquids. So he says there are 7 types of measures. It's interesting, the measures seem to be very similar to what we talked before about pchina, because pchina means to measure, a measure, evaluate, to test, but measure, like measuring how much gold or how much silver rather. So he said there were different types of measures for liquids in the temple. And in Hebrew, the way they measured what we call today, let's say a quart or a pint or other measures and liquid measures, in the time of the Talmud, the expression was hin. There was a hin, it was called. There was a half a hin, there's a third of a hin, and a quarter hin. Let me see if I know the exact amount of measure for that. Let me see here. So, for example, with what liquids we use, we know that in the temple they used oil. They used oil, shemen. They also used wine. Sometimes water, like we talk about Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, the drawing of the water for the Beis Hamikdash, for the Mizbeach. So these, so they had different, I guess, pots, vessels with different measures to be able to measure how much is being used. I'm not sure how much a hin is. I'm just looking if I could find. Okay, I know that a hin is 12 lugim. In Hebrew, lug may be even an ounce, something like an ounce. Oh, yeah. A lug is between 12 and 21 fluid ounces. So a hin is 12 lugim. So it'd be something like around 150 fluid ounces, approximately. Just to give you a sense here. It's not so relevant to what we're learning here, but since we're already looking at it, might as well spell it out. Okay. So now, this is the Lashon that Rabbi Rashab quotes. He says, Shnoshes hoyu bihin. There were markings in the hin measure. Like you never see you use a test tube or other things to dispense medicine, so it'll have markings, like etchings on the keli, so you can know. Here is 1 hin, half a hin, a quarter hin. So he says that's shnosses. Shnosses are the markings, like the incremental markings on the vessel to be able to measure properly. And the markings work like this. At kan lapar. one marking said that until here, it was for the Minchas Nesachim, it was for the offering that was brought that accompanied a bull sacrifice. That's a par. Atkan la'ayil. Here is another measure that we use for a ram sacrifice. And he goes on, Atkan lekeves, a lamb, and so on. So bottom line is, what the Mishnah is saying is here you had an entity that had markings, and each marking is separate because it's different measures. And yet it's all part of one entity. So it says, B'moke Machi explains, there were these markings. The hin is the vessel that measures the amount of the liquid of a hin. Atkan lepar, this said this amount goes for this type of sacrifice, this for another type of sacrifice. Hainu she'enkan is chalkus mamish. Now it's an interesting example that he brings, but it's an example from Torah, from the Beis HaMikdash. So there are markings, there are distinctions, but if you look at it, it's one entity, it's one vessel. There's no chalkus mamish. Da kol hu etzem echad. But this etzem echad has different measures. I would say it's very similar to what he said before about pchina. One entity, but different ways to measure how much each level is in there, but everything is all under one entity. Now, obviously, we'd have to find the original where this is brought to Atzilus to understand what does this example really add. Like, what would we be missing if we didn't have this example? Like, how does this example really help us understand it? That I would reserve for a little more research before I would comment on that. Okay.
Because as a person in the kitchen, you have measuring cups the size of a cup, the size of a half a cup, or you have a giant measuring cup with the etchings. So it's this akudim is that giant etching measuring cup.
I understand, but the example is very clear. My question that I asked was, what does it add that we would not have understood without it? That's all I'm asking. The
Because I don't
example
think
is very clear. I'm not.
One
second. I'm not asking what is the meaning of the example. The example is very clear. It's one entity that has different measures, like he said before about Pchina, which is very much what he wants to explain here, that it's one entity, even though it has 10 energies in it, but it's all part of one keli, like he said, 10 energies in one container. That's clear. Just wondering, is it adding a deeper understanding? I would like to look up where this is, where the Mokamacher, he brings it from another place, just to see if there's something there that helps us understand what it really adds. It's a good motion. That's it. There's no nothing is confusing here. Just pointing that out. That's all.
No, by us, you always use the mashal of the cell with all the things. So I don't know if the Rebbe uses it or that's your mashal. Because
no, that's my mashal. It's not from my morim. No, it's a mashal because it's a mashal to me, very tangible, something that we can visualize instead of it just being abstract. But it's not. It's my mashal. Here, this is a mashal from Chassidus. Yeah. Okay, good. So we have here this example, good. So now to go back to Atzilus, so the Rebbe Rashab now is saying that now with this we can say, similarly, that Atzilus, remember Atzilus is not Akudim. Akudim is a higher level, but Akudim gives us a good explanation because Akudim is also 10 energies in one container. In Atzilus is 10 energies in 10 containers. That's an important qualification. But however, conceptually, we can apply this thinking that he just said about Akudim with the example of the shnoses, of the etchings, the markings on the vessel, that you can apply that in Atzilus, which is imayes, that there is big kalim, energies within containers, nevertheless, they're all one etzem and mahus. They're one core and they're one essence, despite the distinctions that they have. Okay. V'zeu shenikra Atzilus, and this is why we call Atzilus Elam ha'achdus, world of unity. That's the way it's described. Because even though it has parts, but what dominates is the unifying element. Like I said, with the unifying Elam ha'achdus. So kamaimer, like the Zohar, it's a maimer in Tikkun Zohar, Iyu v'chayu yichad, Iyu v'garmu yichad. That you, Hashem, Iyu, are one with your energies, and one with your containers. That's how the Alter Rebbe explains Chayui and Gamuhi. So there's a oneness, Chad. In other places, in Maimorim, Taka says, it doesn't say Iyu v'Chayui v'Gamui Chad. It says it twice, Iyu v'Chayui Chad, Iyu v'Gamui Chad, because the unity of the energy is different than the unity of the containers. But overall, it's one unified, seamless whole, as we've been discussing at length. And Atzilus is Achdus. That's Elam Achdus. Shakol u'b'chinas Achdus mamish. Everything in Atzilus is in a utter unity. And he explained how it's not a contradiction to his chalkus, to distinction. So like he said earlier, there are levels, but they're not nivdalas v'nifradis. They're not different or nivdal, separate or diverse and separate, I should say. It's all part of one entity, and that's what you sense. The Yesh Leimer, now he's going to bring it back. Remember, all this is coming to explain Matan Torah and the Beis Hamikdash, where you have the Gili without the Mumutzayim, without the interfaces, to the point that Re'en es Anishma, the Re'en es Akelis, that they saw the sounds. How's that possible? Seeing and hearing are two different faculties, two different senses. So it says, Yesh Leimer al derech moshel ba'odam lamata. Another Yesh Leimer from the Rebbe Rashab, we can say, for example, by a Adam Lamata, by a human below, like us. The power to see, which is in the eye, and the power to hear in the ear, they're separate, and they are different and separate. Mufre are somewhat synonymous, but it's a little different. Havdalah v'hafrada. Frada is more separate, but bottom line is they're separate. Obviously, they're all part of one human being, and they're coordinated. You know, you have eye and ear coordination, but it's still two different faculties. The Beriya lo yesh shmiya, when regular sight doesn't have any sound in it, you see something, God forbid, you could see a person could be a seeing person, but they could be deaf. Or even if you're a hearing person, you may see something from a distance and you can't hear it because you're out of range. Bottom line is, Riya is not Shmiya. Riya does not have Shmiya within it. Ubishmiya lo yesh Riya. And Shmiya does not have any vision in it. When you hear something, it doesn't mean you're seeing it. It doesn't even have anything of seeing. Obviously, you can see and hear something, but that's both faculties at work. But independently, there's no hiskalulus in that sense. Because with other faculties, for example, Chachma and Bina, there is a Chachma within Bina and a Bina within Chachma. Like with Chesta and Gvura. But Riya and Shmiya, you don't say that. You don't say there's a measure of vision within your hearing. And a measure of seeing within your, a measure of hearing within your seeing, vision. Ubepnimiyusam, he qualifies. The inner dimension of these faculties, so that's not a contradiction. But Pnimiyusam, when you go into the nefesh itself, yes, of course they originate from one place and they're bound and united together. That's why they can work so well together. You know, you see something, you hear something. Right now you're seeing me and you're hearing me speak. There's a certain synchronicity to that. But the faculties as they're actually functioning are two different ingredients. It's just like salt and pepper that you put into a dish. Obviously, once you mix them together, they become part of one entity. But salt and pepper originate as two separate things. Here it's actually the opposite. Here they originate as one, and they break down as two. But the point being was that Pnimiyusam, they are bound. The Rebbe Rashab just wants to qualify that it doesn't mean Riya and Shmiya, when you go all the way back to the source, they will have more connection to them. And then each of them goes and settles in their particular location with their particular function. Now, ubesharshan, and in their root, what is Riya and Shmiya? So we know that Riya is rooted in Koyach HaChachma, power of Chachma, and Shmiya b'Koyach HaBina. Says this in a number of places. Hagam shezeh Chachma v'zeh Bina. So now he's saying, so even though this is Chachma and this is Bina, two separate entities, Kol mokim habina klula b'chachma, like I said before. Nevertheless, bina does encompass chachma within it. B'chachma b'bina. And there's a chachma within bina. Simply put, if chachma is the spark of an idea, so it's true, bina is not the spark any longer. Bina is developing the idea, but bina carries the spark within it. You take the spark of the idea, and now you flesh it out in bina. So there's an element of chachma within bina. That's why one of the advice that we're given, that you're middle of all the details and breaking down details in bina, never forget the point of departure where you originated from. It's a big rule. Very often you come up with an idea, then you start brainstorming, and after a while people say, what was our original idea? And sometimes you even forget where you started. And it gets all confusing. But if you're able to write down the headline, this was our initial point of concept, point of departure. Then we went off and broke it down and said there's many ways to do this. There's this approach and that approach, and you could have many ideas. Then you can and say, let's go back to Nekudas HaChochma. That's called accessing the Nekudas HaChochma through in Bina. And the same thing the other way around. There's a level of Chochma within Bina. I'm sorry, there's the level of, what did I say here? A Bina Klula b'Chochma. So I started the other way around. I should have gone the other order. Okay, but I'll do it this way now. In Chochma, even though it's only a spark, but you have to say that spark has the potential to be fleshed out and broken down into details. So we call that the Bina Klula b'Chochma. And then we have the Chochma Klula b'Bina that I just explained. Shezeh inyan haven b'Chochma v'Chochem b'Bina. An expression in Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Formations, some attributed to Avram Avinu, that there's Haven, there's Bina within Chachma, and there's Chachma within Bina. Now, you could say, ask the question, 1 second, didn't you just say that there's no Riyah within Shmiya and no Shmiya within Riyah? Now you're saying that in their root, they do have one within another. But in a way, the parentheses answer that. Because in the root, they're that way. Once they come down into actual sight and sound, so though in their root they have a connection, but right now there are two faculties. But let's see where he's going now with this. He didn't finish, obviously. The Imba Odam Lamata, says the Rebbe Rashab now. If this is indeed the case with a person below, Imba Odam Lamata who came, Richu Ka'erech Ben Asherish Li Mistayef Memenu. Okay, he's saying exactly that. That if in a person below there's this relative distance between the root, and what is the root? Chachma and Bina. To that which branches off from it. Mistayef means that which is derived, which is drawn from it, or extends from it, which is what Riyah and Shmiya. The B'sharshim hen klulim u'miyuchodim, that in their root, they are klulim, they are interconnected, umiyuchadim, and united, like we just explained. And when they branch into specific faculties, they're two separate faculties. If that's the case, even in a human being, so from this we can extrapolate, we can derive, we can understand the Atzilus. That not Atzilus, this is Lamaila. This is now we're talking Elikus. Hagam shein Chochma Bina, even though there is the faculty called Chochma and Bina, Eina Chochma b'mitzias Chochma, v'lo habina b'mitzias Bina. V'hein b'sachtus gmura ze'im zeh. So even a human being is that way. That the root of Riyah and Shmiya, there's a certain unity. How much more so in Atzilus? Like we said, we're speaking either, even though there is Chachma and Bina, but it's not a mitzias that really separate from one another. And they're entirely united with one another, utterly united in Atzilus. So what the Rebbe Rashab is basically saying, that even in a human being, which is lower than Atzilus, it's lower than Bria actually, it's all the way in Asiya, you still find elements of unity, even amidst diversity. How much more so in Atzilus, which is, like he said, Elam Ha'achdus of Elikus, that you find this. And now he goes back to the original point. And since this Atzilus radiated at the time of Matan Torah, Atzilus Mamish without filters, and that's why by Matan Torah, when Atzilus was radiating in a revealed way, they were able to see the sound, to see the voice or the sounds, and hear the vision, the sight. Without any hischalkus. Because that's what Atzilus is. Once you go into Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, or like we talked about a human being, they become two separate faculties. So regularly, right now, routinely, what you see is not what you hear is not what you see. Two different faculties. Like he said, Riyah and Shmiyah. They coordinate, they can speak to each other, but two separate. But when you have a gili from Atzilus, where what dominates there is the Achdus, so in a sense it eliminates, I don't want to use the word eliminate, maybe too strong of a word, it allows for the crossover to the point of all experiencing one thing. So you see what you hear and you hear what you see. Essentially is the dynamics and science behind synesthesia. There is a phenomenon that way. There are people, Kandinsky was an artist and others that actually experience synesthesia. They actually hear sounds and see sights. And it's been proven. They've been asked. People, they hear a sound and they'll see a color when that sound, when that vibration, and vice versa as well. That when they hear something, they see a color, and when they see something, they actually hear a sound. I once gave a whole class, more than one class probably, on this, and somebody actually in the class had that synesthesia, and he shared afterwards. It was fascinating what he experiences. It's not every sound and every sight, but and they're in common. They see the similar color. That's why they know there's something. It's not an illusion, because you could say maybe it's fantasy. Everybody can fantasize. You can imagine a color when you hear a sound. You could say this feels like color blue. Like an aggressive sound feels like the color red. A calm sound feels like the color, like water running feels like it's blue, because we identify blue with water. But that's more in your mind. But then there are people, and they actually tested it, where two people who were not in the same room, they allowed them to hear different vibrations and sounds, and they described the colors, and they were the same. There are also differences and so on. You can look it up. Synesthesia, it's called. So I gave once a whole class on Matan Torah, the original synesthesia, because when you go, like he says here, and it's a gili from a place where before the wires, basically going back to the engine room, before the wires were defined, so essentially Ri and Shmiya have this crossover like he's describing here. Va'ayamashin is boil the il, and he's telling us to look earlier. This goes back all the way in the beginning of Ayin Beis. He spoke about this more at length. Chapter 19, if you want to look it up, all the way in the beginning. Where he spoke about seeing the sound. I want to just conclude, because remember Matan Torah, he was comparing to the Beis Hamikdash, and then he's going to go back to Golus, Yecheskel, after the Beis Hamikdash. So one more line. And similarly, Similarly is when the temple stood, Beis Hamikdash. Earlier he said Bayis Rishon. She'egili eir Atzilus. At that time there was a revelation of the light of Atzilus, bli shum emtsois, without any interface. V'yagili k'moishahu. And the Gemili was exactly as it was in its original, without any dilution, without any diffusion. So the Beis Hamikdash had a similar Gili like it was by Matan Torah, like we learned earlier, the previous page. I'm going to stop here. He's going to then go on, Mashenkin, but Golos, by Yecheskel, who came after Bayis Rishon, then the concealment caused a change. So no longer having the pure Gili of Atzilus. This will bring us all back to the Malachim and Matat, and the need for Memutzayim and the interfaces. But we'll get to that in the next classes. I'm going to stop here by Mashenkin. Take any questions from anyone. if you have any questions, I'm happy to address any topic.
This was clear and interesting, but I'm intrigued by the riddle that you gave earlier. That maybe the reason that the Rebbe Rasha brings the cup of etchings has to do with the amount. Because if you measured each cup individually, you'd have more. But with the measuring cup with the etching, you have less.
Maybe. I mean, I'm sure there are. I say my approach is I'd go back to find where it's first cited, just to see context there. Maybe there are more details, but it's possible that what you're saying is possible, because the bottom line is yes. The whole point is you have one vessel, not five. You have one vessel that has etchings or markings, and you can then measure for different carbonas, whether it's a hin or half a hin, an ounce or 2 ounces. I mean, but I'm just using those numbers. But and that causes to be all like 10 energies in one container, which works with Akudim perfectly, because Akudim is one container. However, it has 10 energies, so 10 like so-called markings. But the question is really, does the mashal is a mashal gashmi, and maybe that's enough. The mere fact that you have an example that you can literally from the Mishnah and literally use in the kitchen, as you put it, or in this case, the Beis Hamikdash, is enough to, maybe it could be. I'm just wondering, since it's a unique example, whether there's more to it than that's all, but that's good.
Well, the kitchen is Beis Hamikdash Ma'at, so it's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so all this is coming to explain that. Any other questions? Or comments, for that matter? Okay, so we'll stop here. By the word Mashenkin, like almost close to the bottom of page 1448, I should say.